My friends, in one sense, what Jesus asks of us today, in today's gospel, what Jesus asks of us every day is quite simple, really. Everything. There's a famous story, a true one, about St. Francis of Assisi. Now, the image most of us have of St. Francis is one where he is barefoot, usually wearing a very simple brown cassock with a rope tied around his waist. Francis did not always dress like this, my friends. As a young man, in fact, he lived a life very different from the one that we associate with him. He was a good man, but he was also a man of the world, as they say. He loved nice clothes and music, the occasional street brawl, actually, and in general, pleasure. And Francis was usually able to indulge his passions because he was not only good-looking and fun and well-liked, he was also rich. Francis's father, Pietro, was a wealthy cloth merchant, a man with a very keen sense of business and a keen idea of what sort of future his son should have, namely a life in the military as a noble knight. Francis did follow his father's wishes for a time. At one point, he was even taken prisoner as a soldier and held captive for a year. But something was happening to Francis in his heart. Despite the fun, but essentially very superficial life that he was leading up to that point, he felt that something, really someone, was drawing him deeper and deeper into something more meaningful. Francis ultimately got to the point where he felt like he had a choice. He could either live the life that he wanted, a life of the world, so to speak, or live the life that Christ wanted of him. A life dedicated to himself or a life dedicated to Christ. He chose Christ. Needless to say, Francis's father was not pleased, especially when he found out that Francis had been taking some of the money that his father had been giving him, even some of the cloth. His father was a cloth merchant, as I mentioned, and giving it to the poor. He was nursing the poor lepers in town, exactly what Jesus was calling him to do when he called him, all of us, follow me. Pietro, Francis's father, was infuriated. He threatened and he beat him. And it all came to a head, so to speak, one day on the town square. That day, in front of the Bishop of Assisi, the townspeople, and Pietro, Francis took off every last stitch of his expensive clothing, handed it back to his father, and walked away to follow Jesus. He never looked back. My friends, Francis's outward actions, as dramatic as they were really a manifestation of what was inwardly happening and what inwardly we are all called to do. To follow where Jesus leads us, to respond to that tug in our heart, to follow it, and to follow it in trust and in love. Today's gospel seems very harsh to modern ears, and indeed it may have seemed very harsh to the people who heard it for the very first time, all those centuries ago. One of Jesus' disciples approaches him, desiring to follow him. But first, Lord, he says, let me bury my father. I think we all think this is a very reasonable request, certainly. As Christians, we know burying the dead is one of the corporal works of mercy, which we are all called to do. And in Hebrew culture of that time, it was a son's duty to bury his father. Jesus' response then sounds very shocking. Follow me, he says, and let the dead bury their dead. Perhaps Jesus' response, my friends, was meant to shock. There will always be demands that the world makes on us. Some of them will be very important demands and very meaningful demands, and some of them will be less meaningful. But it's oh so easy, my friends, for the demands of the world to seep into every part of our life, including the spiritual part of our life, and pull us away from that. Pull us away from what Christ is calling us to do. Worldly concerns, again, they can so easily seep into even our daily church-going or our weekly church-going. How many Christians, for example, bring their cell phones to church? We certainly aren't going to need them, but we often bring them just in case. In a very literal way, my friends, what Christ is calling us to do, one could say, must be more important than what the world is calling us to do, certainly what they're calling us to do on our cell phones. And we must respond to Christ's call and must give him, and not the world, our very best, our very best. The danger always is, my friends, that worldly things, what we eat, what we watch, what we wear, can so dull us that we become spiritually dead. And perhaps this is what Christ meant today when he said what he said. Leave those who are spiritually dead to the concerns of the world. You, us, we are not spiritually dead. We are spiritually alive, my friends. We are disciples of Christ. We are the light of the world. Let us give Christ everything. Let us follow him and never look back.